Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are moments in the long, grinding history of the Imperium of man where the great machine of human civilization does not buckle under the weight of alien invasion or the creeping horror of demonic incursion. There are moments, rarer and somehow more terrible, where the Imperium tears itself apart from the inside, where the very institutions created to protect humanity become the instruments of its suffering, where faith, the thing that binds a million worlds together under one banner, is twisted and corrupted until it becomes an unrecognizable mockery of everything it was meant to be. The age of apostasy is one of those moments. It is a period stretching across millennia, but concentrated most violently into the 36th millennium. Roughly 5,000 years after the Horus heresy tore the galaxy in half and left the Emperor of mankind entombed upon the Golden Throne. It is the story of how a single ambitious bureaucrat named Goj Vandir seized control of both the Imperium's government and its church, becoming the most powerful individual since the Emperor himself. It is the story of how he plunged the galaxy into a reign of terror so bloody, so unhinged, that it would reshape the Imperium's institutions forever. And it is the story of how a humble preacher from a forgotten world named Sebastian Thor rose up to challenge that tyranny, armed with nothing but faith and the conviction that the Emperor's light could never truly be extinguished. But to understand the age of apostasy, we cannot simply begin with Vandir. We cannot simply drop into the bloodshed and the screaming and the burning of worlds, because this catastrophe did not emerge from nothing. Like a cancer, it grew slowly, quietly, feeding on centuries of unchecked ambition, institutional decay, and the fundamental human weakness of wanting more, always wanting more. To understand how the Imperium fell into the darkest period of civil strife since the Horus heresy, we need to go back. Back to the very beginning of how faith became power, and power became corruption. And corruption became something that nearly brought the entire species to its knees. So settle in, get comfortable. Because this story spans centuries. It involves madmen and saints, tyrants and heroes, assassins and warrior nuns, as in a confrontation before the very throne of the Emperor himself that changed the course of human history. This is the age of apostasy, and it begins, as so many terrible things do, with something that was supposed to be good. The Imperium of man, even in its earliest days after the Horus heresy, was a place of staggering complexity. The Emperor sat upon the Golden Throne, neither truly alive nor dead, his psychic might sustaining the Astronomicon that guided ships through the nightmare dimension of the warp. The Primarchs, those demigod sons who had led his legions, were dead or missing, or lost to treachery. The Space Marine legions themselves had been broken apart into smaller chapters by the dictates of the Codex Astartes, their power deliberately fragmented to ensure that no one commander could ever again wield the kind of military strength that Horus had turned against the Imperium. In the vacuum left by the Emperor's silence and the Primarch's absence, someone had to govern. And so the High Lords of Terror emerged, a council of the most powerful individuals in the Imperium, each representing one of the great institutions of imperial governance: the Master of the Administratum, the Lord Commander Militant, the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and many others. Together, they formed the Senatorum Imperialis, the ruling body that would guide humanity in the Emperor's name. But governing a million worlds is not a clean business. It is messy, political, and deeply, fundamentally human. And humans, no matter how many millennia pass, will never quite manage to evolve past their hunger for power, their capacity for jealousy, and their remarkable talent for convincing themselves that what benefits them personally also benefits everyone else. It was into this environment that the seeds of the age of apostasy were first planted. Not in the 36th millennium, where the most violent events would eventually unfold, but much earlier, centuries earlier, in the crucible of grief and uncertainty that followed the Horus heresy itself. Because when the emperor fell silent, when his voice could no longer be heard guiding humanity forward, people did what people have always done in times of great fear and great loss. They turned to faith, and faith, in the Imperium of man, would prove to be the most dangerous weapon of all. Think about that for a moment. Oh, the Imperium of man has survived alien invasions that consumed entire star systems. It has endured demonic incursions that bent reality itself into screaming knots of impossibility. It has weathered the Horus heresy, the single most devastating civil war in human history, a conflict that saw half of the emperor's own sons turn traitor and nearly succeed in destroying everything their father had built. The Imperium has weathered all of these things and continued grinding forward, battered and bloodied, but unbroken. But the age of apostasy nearly succeeded where all of these external threats failed. Not because it was more powerful, not because it commanded greater armies or more devastating weapons, but because it struck at something the Imperium could not defend with bolters and battleships. It struck at the soul of the Imperium, whilst at the shared faith that bound a million worlds together across the impossible distances of space, at the idea that all of humanity was united in service to the Emperor, and that this service gave meaning to their suffering and purpose to their lives. When that faith was corrupted, when it was twisted into a weapon of oppression by men who saw it as nothing more than a tool for accumulating power, the Imperium did not simply crack, it shattered. Worlds burned, billions died, entire sectors of the galaxy descended into anarchy that made the predations of orcs and Eldar raiders look almost orderly by comparison. The Age of Apostasy is a reminder that the Imperium's greatest vulnerability is not its overtaxed military or its crumbling infrastructure, or the endless tide of enemies pressing in from every direction. Its greatest vulnerability is the thing that holds it all together, the faith of its citizens. Corrupt that faith, and you corrupt everything. But the Age of Apostasy is also a story of hope, of ordinary people who refused to accept tyranny, of a humble preacher who stood against the most powerful man in the galaxy, armed with nothing but conviction and the belief that the Emperor's light could not be extinguished by mere mortal darkness. It is a story that proves that even in the worst of times, even when everything seems lost, the human capacity for courage and righteousness can prevail. Let us begin at the beginning. Let us talk about how faith became power and power became poison. The rise of the ecclesiarchy. When faith became an empire, to understand the Age of Apostasy, you need to understand the ecclesiarchy. And to understand the ecclesiarchy, you need to understand a fundamental irony at the heart of the Imperium's history. The Emperor of mankind did not want to be worshipped as a god. During the Great Crusade, the official doctrine of the Imperium was something called the imperial truth, a philosophy that was emphatically secular. There were no gods, the emperor declared. Religion was superstition, a relic of humanity's darker past that had to be cast aside in the name of reason and progress. When his own son Lorgar, Primarch of the Word-Bearers Legion, began worshipping him as a deity, the emperor was so displeased that he sent the Ultramarines to destroy Lorgar's greatest achievement, the perfect city of Monarchia, as a humiliating lesson. But the lesson did not take. Not really. Because while the emperor could decree that he was not a god, he could not change what lived in the hearts of ordinary men and women who had witnessed his impossible power. They had seen him shatter armies with a gesture. They had watched his legions conquer the galaxy in his name. And when he was interred upon the golden throne, his body broken, but his spirit fighting an eternal war to keep the light of the Astronomicon burning, well, if that was not the act of a god, what was? In the centuries after the heresy, religious cults devoted to the emperor sprang up like wildflowers after a fire. They appeared on every world, in every corner of the Imperium, each one slightly different from the next. Some worshipped the emperor as a warrior god, a deity of battle and righteous fury. Others saw him as a savior, while a being who had sacrificed his own mortality for the redemption of all humankind. Still others viewed him as a stern judge of the dead, a cosmic arbiter who would one day return to weigh the worth of every human soul. Among these countless sects, one gradually rose above all the others. It was called the Temple of the Savior Emperor, and it was, for lack of a better comparison, the Catholic Church of the far future. It absorbed smaller cults, either through persuasion or through the more direct method of simply crushing them. It developed a rigid hierarchy of priests, confessors, cardinals, and at its summit, the ecclesiarch, who served as the supreme religious authority of all humankind. By the early 32nd millennium, roughly 1,000 years after the Horus Heresy, the Temple of the Savior Emperor had become the dominant religious force in the Imperium. Nearly 2/3 of all imperial citizens followed its teachings, with the only major exceptions being the Space Marines, who had their own warrior traditions, and the Adeptus Mechanicus, who worshipped the Emperor in their own way as the Omnissiah, the machine god. Recognizing the political power that came with controlling the spiritual lives of untold billions, the High Lords of Terror officially recognized the Temple of the Savior Emperor as the state religion of the Imperium. It was given a new, more formal title, the Adeptus Ministorum, and it was granted an official seat among the Imperium's governing institutions, separate from the Adeptus Terra, but wielding enormous influence over it. A few centuries later, the ecclesiarch, as a figure named Veneris II, was granted a seat on the Senatorum Imperialis itself, placing the leader of the imperial faith among the High Lords of Terror. 300 years after that, this seat was made permanent, cementing the ecclesiarchy's position as one of the most powerful institutions in the entire Imperium. And this is where the trouble really began. Because with political power came resources. The ecclesiarchy began levying tithes and taxes on the faithful, drawing enormous wealth from every world under imperial rule. Lavish shrines, towering temples, and majestic cathedrals were erected across the galaxy, each one larger and more extravagant than the last. Millions of pilgrims traveled the stars to visit particularly sacred locations, and every journey, every offering, every whispered prayer filled the ecclesiarchy's coffers with more gold, more influence, more raw power. The vast territories of the Imperium were organized into dioceses, each overseen by a cardinal who wielded both spiritual and political authority over hundreds of worlds. These cardinals commanded missionaries and preachers, funded armies of the faithful, and built monuments to the emperor's glory that stretched toward the heavens like stone prayers. The ecclesiarchy was no longer simply a church. It was an empire within the empire, a power unto itself that answered to no authority it did not choose to recognize. And it had an army. The Fratres Templar were the ecclesiarchy's own military force, a standing army completely separate from the Astra Militarum and the Imperial Navy. They were fanatical warriors, stripped of their individuality and rebuilt entirely around the tenets of the Imperial Creed, with the sole purpose of fighting and dying in the Emperor's name. During the Age of Apostasy, these Templars would become fearsome zealots, fighting with their torsos bare to display the ritual scars and religious tattoos that covered their muscular bodies. Each Templar was equipped with a spinal implant that generated a shimmering energy shield, and they carried high-cadence las blasters and gold-hilted swords forged from pure hematite. Combined with their countless warships and transport vessels, the Fratres Templar represented a military force strong enough to rival entire sectors of the Astra Militarum. The only major religious order that stood in opposition to the ecclesiarchy's growing dominance was a group called the Confederation of Light. Founded on a distant world called Dimamar, the Confederation represented a radically different interpretation of the imperial faith. Where the ecclesiarchy preached that wealth and material sacrifice were the keys to salvation, the Confederation of Light advocated poverty, humility, and genuine service to others. They believed the emperor's sacrifice should serve as an example for all humanity, not as justification for building ever larger monuments and demanding ever greater tithes. You can probably guess how the ecclesiarchy responded to this. Toward the end of the 33rd millennium, the ecclesiarch declared the Confederation of Light a heretical organization and launched the First War of Faith. Vast armies of the Astra Militarum, entire fleets of the Imperial Navy, and thousands of fanatical zealots were unleashed upon the Confederation. It was not a war in any conventional sense. It was an extermination. The forces that descended upon Dimmermar and the surrounding systems were overwhelming, and the Confederation of Light was smashed. Most of its followers were killed or scattered. Only a handful of survivors managed to escape, hiding their forbidden beliefs in secret cells and hidden shrines, waiting for a day when they might practice their faith once more. The destruction of the Confederation of Light removed the last major check on the ecclesiarchy's spiritual authority. The Ministerum's power was now absolute. Every world in the Imperium bore a cathedral in the Emperor's name. Every citizen, from the lowliest hive worker to the most powerful planetary governor, lived under the shadow of the ecclesiarchy's influence. The ecclesiarch was regarded as the voice of the Emperor himself, and questioning his authority was tantamount to heresy. And here is the critical thing, the thing that made everything that followed inevitable. When a single institution controls both the spiritual lives and the political destinies of countless billions of people, when it commands armies and fleets, when it can declare anyone a heretic and have them executed without trial, it does not stay pious for long. Power corrupts, as the old saying goes. And the ecclesiarchy had more power than any religious institution in human history. The cardinals grew fat on wealth that should have fed the hungry. Now the temples grew more elaborate while the worlds around them crumbled. The tithes grew heavier, crushing the populations that were forced to pay them. And when people protested, when they begged for relief or dared to question whether the emperor truly wanted his children to suffer so that his priests could live in luxury, the Frateres Templar were dispatched to remind them that obedience was not optional. The Imperium was sowing the seeds of its own destruction, and no one in a position of power seemed to notice. Or perhaps they noticed and simply did not care, because for them, the system was working perfectly. Consider the sheer scale of what the ecclesiarchy had become by the eve of the Age of Apostasy. By the end of the 33rd millennium, every imperial world was furnished with its own cathedral, not a chapel, not a shrine, a cathedral, a massive structure of stone and metal and stained glass that dominated the skyline of every major city on every planet under imperial rule. The coffers of the ecclesiarchy overflowed with the offerings and tithes of billions upon billions of faithful citizens. And this wealth was not being used to feed the hungry, or heal the sick, or defend the vulnerable. It was being used to build more cathedrals, bigger cathedrals, cathedrals with spires that could be seen from orbit, cathedrals decorated with precious metals and gemstones, cathedrals that took generations to complete and consumed the labor of entire populations in the process. The ecclesiarch had become, in practical terms, the most powerful individual in the Imperium. As the voice of the emperor, and the ecclesiarch could direct the high lords of terror with near absolute authority. He could wage wars, he could change laws, he could levy massive tithes at whim. Worlds that resisted the ecclesiarchy's demands were subjected to wars of faith. Military campaigns funded by the Ministerum and carried out by the Frateres Templar that were essentially punitive expeditions designed to bring rebellious populations back into line through overwhelming force. The ecclesiarchy's power was not just spiritual or political, it was economic. The tithes demanded by the Ministerum represented an enormous drain on the Imperium's productive capacity. Resources that could have been used to maintain infrastructure, develop new technologies, or equip the Astra Militarum were instead funneled into religious construction projects and the personal enrichment of the ecclesiarchy's upper echelons. The cardinals lived in palaces that rivaled those of planetary governors. They travelled in ships that were floating cathedrals in their own right, complete with choirs, incense burners, and gold-plated bulkheads. They commanded retinues of servants and bodyguards and advisors that would have made many sector governors weep with envy. Meanwhile, on the worlds that funded this extravagance, people starved. Factories shut down because they could not obtain the raw materials that had been diverted to cathedral construction. Planetary defense forces went under-equipped because the tithes left no resources for military procurement. Trade networks collapsed because the ecclesiarchy's fleets took priority in the congested shipping lanes. The Imperium was slowly, systematically being hollowed out to fuel the ecclesiarchy's insatiable appetite for grandeur. It would not work perfectly for much longer. The gathering storm, institutional decay, and the road to catastrophe. As the millennia ground forward, the political landscape of the Imperium became an increasingly tangled web of competing interests, personal vendettas, and institutional power grabs. The ecclesiarchy was not the only organization hungry for dominance. The administratum, that colossal bureaucratic machine responsible for the day-to-day governance of 1,000,000 worlds, had watched the ministorums rise with growing resentment for centuries. But the administratum had been the dominant political force within the Imperium's governing structure. Its functionaries managed the tithes, organized the census data, coordinated the deployment of resources, and generally kept the incomprehensibly vast machinery of imperial governance grinding forward. But as the ecclesiarchy's influence grew, the administratum found itself increasingly sidelined. Decisions that should have been made by bureaucrats and administrators were instead being made by cardinals and confessors. Resources that should have funded the maintenance of infrastructure and the equipping of armies were being diverted into the construction of ever more elaborate monuments to the emperor's glory. The administratum did not take this lying down. Over the course of the 35th millennium, it launched a sustained campaign to claw back its lost political power. This was not an open war, nothing so dramatic. It was a shadow conflict fought with forged documents, planted informants, bribed officials, and the careful placement of incompetent or corrupt individuals into positions of ecclesiarchal authority. The administratum's agents worked to ensure that the ecclesiarchs and cardinals who rose to power were weak, venal, or easily controlled, thereby undermining the ministorum's ability to effectively wield its enormous influence. And it worked to a degree. The administratum did regain some of its former political clout, but the methods it employed had devastating consequences for the Imperium as a whole. By deliberately installing incompetent leaders within the ecclesiarchy and promoting corruption as a tool of political warfare, the administratum ensured that the institution responsible for the spiritual welfare of countless billions of people was being run by fools, charlatans, and criminals. Meanwhile, the broader Imperium was suffering. Warp storms of unprecedented ferocity swept across the galaxy, severing communication and travel routes between entire sectors. Worlds that had relied on regular shipments of food, materials, and military support found themselves cut off, isolated, left to fend for themselves against whatever threats emerged from the darkness. Some fell to alien invasion. Others descended into anarchy as local governments collapsed under the weight of neglect and despair. On hundreds of worlds, uprisings broke out against the ecclesiarchy's crushing tithes. Common people, driven to desperation by poverty and starvation, rose up against the priests and cardinals who demanded their last scraps of wealth in the emperor's name. Crazed zealots appeared on world after world, preaching that the emperor was displeased with the ecclesiarchy's greed and excess, that the warp storms were his punishment for their sins. Citizens turned to flagellation and self-mutilation to prove their love of the emperor. Entire populations were slaughtered for the heresy of a single individual. The ecclesiarchy's response to these uprisings was brutally simple. The Frateres Templar were deployed to crush the revolts with overwhelming force. Anyone who questioned the ecclesiarchy's authority was declared a heretic and executed. Some of the more fanatical ecclesiarchs went further, using the Officio Assassinorum to eliminate planetary governors who dared redirect their tithes toward feeding their own people rather than filling the Ministerum's treasury. Through all of this, the Adeptus Astartes and the Adeptus Mechanicus watched from the sidelines with growing unease. The Space Marine chapters, bound by ancient oaths to stay out of the mortal politics of terror, focused on defending their own domains and prosecuting the Imperium's endless wars against alien threats. The Mechanicus, insular as always, retreated behind the walls of their forge worlds and continued their sacred work of maintaining the Imperium's technology. Both organizations recognized that something was deeply wrong with the Imperium's governance, but neither was willing or able to intervene. And it was in this environment of institutional decay, political warfare, and widespread suffering that Goj Vandaya made his move. The Imperium was weakened, its institutions corrupted, its people broken by centuries of misrule. It was ripe for the taking, and Vandaya, whatever else might be said about him, was a man who knew an opportunity when he saw one. The stage was set, the actors were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on one of the bloodiest dramas in the long, agonizing history of humankind. The galaxy itself seemed to sense the coming catastrophe. In the centuries preceding Vandaya's rise, warp storms of unusual frequency and intensity battered the Imperium's shipping lanes and communication networks. Some scholars have speculated that these storms were not random natural phenomena, but some form of psychic echo, a reflection of the growing turmoil within the Imperium's collective consciousness projected into the immaterium. Others attribute them to the machinations of the Chaos Gods, those dark entities that feed on human suffering and who stood to gain enormously from the Imperium tearing itself apart. Whatever their cause, the practical effect was devastating. Entire sectors were cut off from terror for years at a time. Worlds that had relied on regular communication with the Imperial Center found themselves adrift, uncertain of what was happening beyond their own solar systems, unable to call for help when threats emerged. This isolation fed the growing sense of abandonment and resentment that was spreading through the Imperium's population, where people who could not reach the Imperial government began to feel that the Imperial government had abandoned them. And in many cases, they were right. The ecclesiarchy's response to the warp storms was characteristically self-serving. Their priests declared the storms a punishment from the emperor for insufficient faith, a divine chastisement that could only be lifted through greater devotion, greater sacrifice, greater tithes. Citizens who were already suffering under the weight of the ecclesiarchy's demands were told that their suffering was their own fault, that they had not prayed hard enough, given enough, sacrificed enough. The solution, naturally, was to give more. It was psychological manipulation on a galactic scale. And it worked, because when people are frightened and desperate, they will cling to any explanation that offers hope, even if that hope comes with a price tag that would beggar a planet. Into this perfect storm of institutional decay, political warfare, and widespread suffering, the man who would become the Imperium's greatest monster saw his opportunity, and he seized it with both hands. Goga Vandaya, the tyrant who swallowed an empire. Goga Vandaya was the 361st Master of the Administratum, and by every account that has survived the passage of millennia, he was a man of extraordinary ambition, considerable cunning, and absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. He did not rise to power through merit or competence. He rose through the ruthless application of bribes, threats, and outright assassination. Those who stood in his way had a tendency to die under mysterious circumstances or simply vanish, their positions conveniently falling to individuals who owed their advancement to Vandaya's patronage. Any who dared speak out against him found themselves silenced with permanent efficiency. The message was clear: oppose Gog Vandaya and cease to exist. Even before he made his grand play for supreme power, Vandaya was known as a strident opponent of the ecclesiarchy. He publicly railed against the Ministerum's corruption, its overreach, its bloated wealth and political manipulation. And in this, at least, he was not entirely wrong. The ecclesiarchy was corrupt, It was overreaching. It was using its influence to distort the governance of the Imperium for its own benefit. Vandyra's criticism resonated with many within the Administratum and the broader imperial government, who had watched the Ministorum's ascendancy with growing alarm. But Vandyra's opposition to the ecclesiarchy was never principled. He did not want to reform the system. He did not want to redistribute power for the good of the Imperium. He wanted all of that power for himself. His first step was to install a puppet ecclesiarch. Shortly before his own ascension to the rank of High Lord, Vandyre engineered the selection of a man named Paulus III to lead the Adeptus Ministorum. Paulus was, by every reliable account, perhaps the weakest and most incompetent individual ever to have held the office of ecclesiarch. He was chosen specifically for these qualities. Vandyre did not need a strong leader heading the ecclesiarchy. He needed a figurehead, a vessel that could be easily controlled and, when the time came, easily discarded. With Paulus in place, Vandyre consolidated his position as Master of the Administratum, the highest-ranking bureaucratic official in the entire Imperium. He surrounded himself with loyalists, placed his agents in key positions throughout the imperial government, and systematically eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. Then, when he was ready, he made his move. Leading a band of his most trusted retainers, armed soldiers who had sworn personal loyalty to him rather than to the Imperium, Vandyre forced entry into the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra. His men gunned down anyone who stood in their way, cutting a bloody path through the palace's defenders until they reached the chambers of Ecclesiarch Paulus III. Vandyre declared Paulus a heretic, a puppet whose degeneracy had disgraced the imperial faith. And then he had him shot. It was a military coup, plain and simple. Vandyre had overthrown the head of the Imperium's state religion with armed force, and in the same breath, he declared himself the new ecclesiarch. He now held two of the most powerful positions in the Imperium simultaneously, Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum. No single individual had wielded this much concentrated power since the Emperor himself had walked among men. The High Lords of Terra, that council of the Imperium's most powerful officials, watched this unfold with a mixture of horror and paralysis. Some had been bribed or blackmailed into supporting Vandyre. Others were too frightened to oppose him. And those who might have spoken out found themselves facing the very real possibility that doing so would result in their own violent removal from power. Vandyre wasted no time in consolidating his position. He purged the ecclesiarchy of anyone who showed even a hint of independence or opposition. Those cardinals who had not already fled were given a simple choice: swear absolute loyalty to Vandyre or die. Some chose loyalty. Many did not get the choice at all. A group of cardinals who attempted to escape Vandyre's purge gathered onto a single ship and fled toward Ophelia VII, a cardinal world far from Terra, where they hoped to establish an independent power base. They never arrived. Their ship was swallowed by a massive warp storm as it entered the Imperium and was never seen again. Vandyre, with characteristic opportunism, seized upon their disappearance as proof that the Emperor himself had struck them down for opposing his chosen representative. Yet he used this supposed divine validation to further cement his authority, declaring that any who opposed him were opposing the will of the Emperor. With the old guard eliminated, Vandyre filled the ecclesiarchy's ranks with new cardinals of his own choosing. Some were weak-minded sycophants who would agree to anything he said. Others were brilliant but cruel individuals who were perfectly willing to serve a madman as long as the rewards were sufficient. Together, they formed a governing elite that answered to one man and one man alone: Goga Vandyre, High Lord of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, the most powerful tyrant the galaxy had seen in 10,000 years. Now, you might be wondering at this point, where was everybody else? Where were the Space Marines? Where was the Mechanicus? Where was the Inquisition? Or how could one man simply seize control of the Imperium's two most powerful institutions without anyone stopping him? The answer lies in the nature of the Imperium itself. Communication in the far future is agonizingly slow and unreliable. Messages sent by astropathic choir can take weeks, months, or even years to reach their destination, if they arrive at all. The warp storms that had been ravaging the galaxy made travel and communication even more difficult than usual. Many Space Marine chapters were thousands of light years from Terra, fighting wars against alien threats that demanded their full attention. The Mechanicus was similarly occupied, defending their forge worlds and maintaining the technology that kept the Imperium functioning. And Vandire, for all his madness, was careful. Yet he went to great lengths to present himself as a legitimate ruler, deferring publicly to the Emperor's authority, even as he twisted it to serve his own purposes. He did not openly declare himself above the Emperor. He claimed to speak with the Emperor's voice, to act as his faithful servant. For those too far away to see the truth, for those whose only information came through carefully controlled channels of communication, Vandire's rule could be made to look like business as usual. By the time the full extent of his treachery became known to the wider Imperium, it was already too late. The tyrant was entrenched, his armies were mobilized, and the reign of blood had begun. The daughters of San'Lior, a fateful discovery. Before we plunge into the full horror of Vandire's reign of blood, we need to take a detour. It's because the story of the Age of Apostasy is not just the story of a tyrant's rise and fall. It is also the story of the women who made his reign possible and who ultimately brought it to an end. On a world called San'Lior, far from the political machinations of Terra, there existed a small and largely unknown religious order called the Daughters of the Emperor. They were an all-female cult, perhaps no more than 500 members at their peak, dedicated to the worship of the Emperor through what they called inner purity. Unlike the bloated, wealth-obsessed ecclesiarchy, the daughters lived simply, devoting themselves to meditation, prayer, and the relentless study of martial arts. They were warriors as much as they were worshippers, honing their combat skills throughout their entire lives with a dedication that would have impressed even the Adeptus Astartes. The daughters had managed to remain largely hidden from the wider Imperium for centuries, their small community too insignificant to draw the attention of the ecclesiarchy's vast bureaucratic machinery. But Vandire had spies everywhere, an enormous network of informants that combed the galaxy for any religious organization that operated outside his control. And eventually, word of the Daughters of the Emperor reached his ears. Vandire's initial reaction was fury. People were worshipping the Emperor in a way he did not control. This was intolerable, a direct challenge to his authority as ecclesiarch. But as his agents provided more detailed reports about the daughters, their martial prowess and their fanatical devotion, Vandire's fury gave way to something far more calculating. He saw an opportunity. Vandire ordered a ship readied and announced that he would be visiting San'Lior personally. He took with him nearly 100 soldiers and servants, a mile-long procession that wound its way through San'Lior's modest settlements toward the Daughters' Temple. His agents moved ahead of him, forcing the local population to line the streets and bow in submission as the ecclesiarch passed. When Vandire reached the temple, he found the gates barred against him. A young daughter informed him, politely but firmly, that the cult did not recognize his authority. The Daughters of the Emperor served the Emperor and the Emperor alone. They had no interest in the politics of Terra or the machinations of the ecclesiarchy. Vandire had expected this resistance. In fact, he had planned for it. He was not going to force his way into the temple. He was going to do something far more insidious. He was going to make the daughters come to him willingly. He requested permission to enter the temple with only a small bodyguard. Once inside, he knelt before the altar of the Emperor and appeared to pray, clutching something hidden beneath his robes. Then he stood and announced that he would demonstrate the Emperor's divine favor. He ordered one of his guards to shoot him. The officer hesitated. The daughters watched in stunned silence. Then the guard raised his laspistol and fired directly into Vandire's chest. There was a blinding flash of light. When it faded, Vandire was still standing, unhurt. The daughters gasped, Several fell to their knees. Here, before their very eyes, was proof that this man was blessed by the Emperor. The bolt of energy had struck him full in the chest, and he had not so much as flinched. Surely this was a miracle. Surely this was a sign from the God Emperor himself. What the daughters did not know, what no one in that temple knew, was that Vandyre was wearing the rosarius of the ecclesiarch, a sacred badge of office that contained a powerful conversion field generator. The rosarius had absorbed the energy of the last bolt, redirecting it harmlessly away from Vandyre's body. It was technology, not divinity, that had saved him, but the daughters, isolated on their remote world, had no knowledge of such devices. They saw what Vandyre wanted them to see, a man protected by the Emperor's own hand. The daughters of the Emperor swore loyalty to Vandyre virtually on the spot. Their entire order, every warrior, every novice, every elder, pledged themselves to his service. They were renamed the Brides of the Emperor and were transported back to Terra, where the finest military instructors in the Imperium began transforming them from skilled but informal warriors into an elite fighting force of staggering lethality. Vandyre would later brag about his deception to his personal scribes, gloating over the gamble he had taken. He had hoped that the daughters would not recognize the rosarius or understand energy field technology, and his gamble had paid off handsomely. In the daughters of the Emperor, he had acquired something beyond price, a force of utterly devoted, supremely skilled warriors who believed with absolute sincerity that Vandyre was the Emperor's chosen representative. They would fight for him with a fanaticism that no bribe could buy and no threat could compel.
Now, real quick before we keep going, I just want to say this is honestly one of my favorite periods in all of 40k lore. And the reason is because it's not about some massive alien threat or a demon breaking through reality. It's just people, humans doing what humans do when they get too much power and nobody's watching. Vandyre isn't scary because he's a superhuman or a sorcerer. He's scary because he's a bureaucrat. He's a guy who's figured out the system, exploited it, and nobody stopped him until millions were already dead. That hits different than a hive fleet or a black crusade, because you look at real history and you can point to a dozen guys who basically did the same thing. That's what makes this era so compelling to me. It feels real in a way that a lot of 40k doesn't. But anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
Over the decades that followed, the Brides of the Emperor were expanded from their original 500 members to a force of over 10,000 elite warriors. They served as Vandyre's personal bodyguard, his most trusted enforcers, and, according to some accounts, his personal companions in every sense of the word. They tasted his food, nursed him through illness, entertained him with singing and dancing, and dealt with his enemies with terrifying efficiency. When a cabal of cardinals attempted to assassinate Vandyre, the brides entered the meeting chamber, locked the doors behind them, and emerged 1 hour later, carrying the severed heads of every cardinal present. The message was received. No one attempted to assassinate Vandyre again. The brides were not evil. They were not corrupt. They genuinely believed they were serving the Emperor's will by serving Vandyre. They were women of extraordinary faith and courage who had been deceived by a man without conscience, manipulated into becoming instruments of tyranny through a trick that exploited their deepest beliefs. It is one of the great tragedies of the age of apostasy that these women, who would later prove to be among the most righteous and courageous warriors in imperial history, spent decades as the willing enforcers of a madman's reign. But their story was not over, not by a long measure, because the same faith that had been used to deceive them would, in the end, and be the very thing that set them free. The reign of blood, 7 decades of madness. With the brides of the Emperor at his side, and the full resources of both the administratum and the ecclesiarchy at his command, Goja Vandyre unleashed a reign of terror upon the Imperium that would earn the name by which it is still remembered 10,000 years later, the Reign of Blood. For 7 decades, Vandyre ruled the Imperium according to the whims of an increasingly unhinged mind. His early years in power had been characterized by a calculating cunning, the ruthless but rational application of political and military force in pursuit of concrete goals. But absolute power, wielded without check or consequence for decades on end, has a corrosive effect on even the strongest minds. And Van Dyer's mind had never been particularly strong to begin with. Well, as the years wore on, Van Dyer's behavior became increasingly erratic and bizarre. He commissioned a holographic map of the entire galaxy and would spend hours staring at it, jabbing his finger at random worlds and issuing edicts that ranged from the merely absurd to the genuinely horrifying. On some worlds, he ordered the entire population subjected to gene virus bombardment to eliminate perceived mutations. On others, citizens were forbidden from looking at the sky, though no explanation for this prohibition was ever provided. He demanded that worlds construct statues in his honor, so massive that many of them towered over the existing monuments to the emperor himself. Worlds that failed to comply faced punitive expeditions from the Fraterist Templar. Worlds that did comply often bankrupted themselves in the process, their populations starving while immense quantities of resources were poured into ego monuments that served no purpose except to glorify a madman. The immense resources of the Adeptus Ministorum were directed toward Van Dyer's perverse orders. Enormous new temples and cathedrals were constructed on distant worlds, their spires reaching toward the stars in testament to the High Lord's glory. But on Terra itself, the ecclesiarchal palace was allowed to fall into decay. Vast wings of the palace collapsed under the weight of centuries, and the enormous chandeliers and incense burners in the audience chambers were allowed to go dark. No one dared enter Van Dyer's presence without permission, so erratic had his outbursts become. Only the brides of the emperor moved freely through his domain. Van Dyer's insanity was always directed outward. But he did not destroy himself or his immediate surroundings. He destroyed everything else. Distant worlds bore the full brunt of his madness, while Terra itself became a sealed fortress, accessible only to those the High Lord chose to admit. The ecclesiarchal palace, once a center of religious devotion and political authority, became a labyrinth of decay inhabited by a lunatic and his warrior handmaidens. The purges were the worst of it. Van Dyer saw enemies everywhere, in the ecclesiarchy, in the administratum, in the military, in the civilian population. Anyone who displeased him, anyone who showed insufficient enthusiasm for his rule, anyone who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time could find themselves declared a heretic and subjected to the most extreme punishments imperial law allowed. And since Van Dyer was both the head of imperial law enforcement and the supreme religious authority, the punishments he allowed were limited only by his imagination. Surveillance servo skulls monitored citizens on countless worlds, recording their movements and conversations, searching for any sign of disloyalty. Random purges swept through entire sectors, killing thousands or even millions on the basis of fabricated evidence or pure paranoia. Nearly 14 billion souls were slaughtered during what became known as the Purge of Lastrati, one of the most concentrated acts of mass murder in the Imperium's blood-soaked history. For the masses of the Imperium, there were only two options: submit utterly to Van Dyer's rule and hope that submission was enough to keep them alive, or resist, and be crushed by the brides of the Emperor and the Fraterist Templar. Most submitted. What choice did they have? The institutions that might have protected them, the military, the Inquisition, the Space Marines, were either too far away, too compromised, or too bound by their own protocols to intervene. The Imperium was a machine designed to grind forward regardless of who was at the controls, and Van Dyer had seized those controls with an iron grip that nothing short of open rebellion could break. Let us pause here for a moment and consider the human cost of what was happening, because it is easy, when telling stories on a galactic scale, to lose sight of the individual, to talk about billions dying as though they were numbers on a page, rather than actual people with lives and families and dreams. Yet the rain of blood was not an abstraction. It was lived. It was suffered through by real human beings on thousands of worlds across the Imperium. Imagine being a farmer on some distant agri-world, working the same fields your family had worked for generations, paying your tithes dutifully, and praying to the emperor every evening before sleep. One day, the local cardinal announces that the High Lord has declared a new tithe. 60% of everything your world produces is to be shipped off-world to fund the construction of a cathedral on some planet you have never heard of. Your world was already running thin. This new demand means starvation. You protest, not violently, just a petition, a humble request for mercy. The next week, Frateris Templar arrive. They burn your village. They kill your neighbors. Or they declare your world purged of heretical sentiment and move on to the next. That was life during the reign of blood. Magnify it by 1,000,000 worlds and 70 years, and you begin to understand the scale of the suffering. On hive worlds, entire levels of the underhive were sealed, and their populations left to starve when they failed to meet Vandai's production quotas. On shrine worlds, ancient relics and holy artifacts were confiscated and melted down to fund the construction of new monuments to the High Lord's glory. On agri-worlds, farming populations were worked to death to feed armies that existed only to impose Vandai's will on other populations that would then be worked to death in turn. It was a cycle of exploitation so vicious, so self-consuming, that even Vandai's own advisors sometimes wondered how long it could possibly continue. The answer, as it turned out, was not much longer. Because in the same way that a fire cannot burn forever without consuming the fuel that feeds it, tyranny cannot sustain itself forever on the suffering of its subjects. Eventually, the suffering produces something that tyranny cannot control. But as Vandai's insanity deepened, so too did the suffering of his subjects. And suffering, pushed far enough, eventually transforms into something else entirely. It transforms into rage. And rage, given a voice and a purpose, becomes revolution. Sebastian Thor and the light that would not die. On the world of Dimamar, far from terror, far from the ecclesiarchal palace and its decaying grandeur, a man was preaching. His name was Sebastian Thor, and he was, well, by every account that has come down to us across the millennia, the most ordinary of extraordinary men. He was not a military genius. He was not a political mastermind. He was not a powerful psyker or a genetically enhanced warrior. He was a priest, a simple, humble priest who had grown up on Dimamar and devoted his life to spreading the Emperor's word. But Thor lived during the reign of blood, and the word he had grown up preaching, the message of faith and service and devotion that had given meaning to his life, had been twisted beyond recognition by Vandai's regime. The Emperor's name was being used to justify slavery and murder and madness on a galactic scale. The faith that was supposed to unite humanity was being wielded as a weapon to crush it. Thor could not accept this. Something deep inside him, something that he believed came directly from the Emperor himself, would not allow him to stay silent while everything he held sacred was being desecrated. And so he began to preach. He did not preach violence. He did not call for war or revenge. He preached what the Confederation of Light had preached before its destruction centuries earlier, that the Emperor's sacrifice should inspire humility, not greed, that the imperial faith should serve the people, not enslave them, that the true measure of devotion was not the size of the cathedrals you built or the weight of the tithes you paid, but the depth of your compassion and the sincerity of your service to your fellow human beings. It was a radical message. In the context of the reign of blood, it was a revolutionary one, and people listened. But they listened because Thor spoke with a charisma and a passion that seemed to transcend normal human eloquence. There was something about his voice, something in the way he looked at you when he spoke, that made you believe he was speaking the truth. Not just any truth, but the truth, the deep, fundamental reality of what the Emperor wanted for his children. People traveled from across Dimamar to hear him preach. They came skeptical and left transformed. They went home and repeated his words to their families and neighbors, and those people came to hear Thor speak, and they too were transformed. Word spread. Beyond Dimmermar, beyond the immediate surrounding systems, the name Sebastian Thor began to appear in reports and dispatches across the Segmentum Obscurus. A young intelligence agent arrived on Terra with a report from the distant frontier. The report was merely disturbing by the standards of the time, but when it reached Vandir, the High Lord erupted into an apocalyptic rage. Dimmermar had openly declared Vandir a traitor to humanity. One name was being heard repeatedly across the entire Segmentum Obscurus: Sebastian Thor. The High Lords debated for over a month about what should be done. Vandir himself withdrew into brooding silence, sitting huddled on his velvet throne, flanked by his brides, staring at nothing. Some of the High Lords feared that Thor might be a demon in disguise, a creature of the warp seeking to destabilize the Imperium. Others suspected he was simply a madman who had gotten lucky with his timing, but no one seemed to take seriously the possibility that he was exactly what he appeared to be: a good man who had decided that enough was enough. Within 3 months of the initial report, over 80 star systems had joined Thor's growing movement, and the number would have been higher if not for the military might of the ecclesiarchy holding other populations in check. Thor's supporters were not soldiers. They were ordinary people, farmers and factory workers, and clerks and pilgrims, united by a shared conviction that the Emperor's faith deserved better than what Vandir had made of it. It was then that members of the long-suppressed Confederation of Light emerged from hiding. These were men and women who had concealed their forbidden beliefs since the First War of Faith in the 33rd Millennium, passing their traditions down through generations of secrecy and persecution. They came to Thor, these hooded figures carrying the weight of centuries of hidden faith, and what words passed between them may never be known. But after that meeting, Thor and the Confederation became as one. The reformed Confederation of Light, reborn around the person and message of Sebastian Thor, became a galactic movement that threatened the very foundations of Vandir's regime. Governor Gaius Welkonen of Dimmermar was so moved by Thor's message that he placed the planet's entire military force at Thor's command. The Patanova of the Navigators, those mutant humans whose psychic abilities were essential for guiding ships through the warp, gave Thor the honorary title of Abstractor Preomnis, Master of the Warp, and a recognition of the seemingly supernatural protection that surrounded him and his followers. Vandir finally responded the only way he knew how. He ordered the Frateris Templar to destroy Dimmermar entirely, to reduce it to ash and kill every living thing on its surface. A vast fleet was assembled at the Clax system and dispatched to carry out the High Lord's command. The fleet never arrived. As the Frateris Templar Armada entered the warp, it was struck by a warp storm of such unprecedented fury that every ship, every soldier, every piece of equipment was torn apart and scattered across the Imperium. The storm was so powerful that it persists to this day, 4,000 years later, a permanent scar in the fabric of reality. And astropaths and other psychers claim that the screams of those who died in the storm can still be heard echoing through the warp, a chorus of agony that has lasted for 40 centuries. The storm became known as the Storm of the Emperor's Wrath, and for the people of the Imperium, its meaning was unmistakable. The Emperor himself had reached out from his golden throne and destroyed the army that had been sent to silence his faithful servant. Thor was under divine protection. To oppose him was to oppose the will of the God Emperor of mankind. The destruction of the Frateris Templar fleet was the spark that lit the fuse. The entire Segmentum Obscurus erupted into open rebellion against Vandir's rule. Cardinal palaces were stormed by mobs of enraged citizens. The beautiful hangings and ornate decorations that had been purchased with the blood and sweat of the faithful were torn down and burned. Vandir's spies and informants were hunted through the streets and driven away or killed. World after world declared for Sebastian Thor and the Confederation of Light. The scale of the rebellion was staggering. Decades of suppressed rage and accumulated suffering erupted simultaneously across hundreds of star systems. Worlds that had submitted meekly to Vandire's edicts for years suddenly found their courage, inspired by the knowledge that the Emperor himself had struck down the army sent to destroy his servant. The cardinal palaces, those symbols of ecclesiastical excess that had been built on the backs of starving populations, became the primary targets of the people's wrath. On some worlds, as the palaces were stripped to their foundations within hours, their contents distributed among the poor who had been forced to pay for them. On others, the buildings were left standing but converted into shelters for the homeless and the hungry, a deliberate inversion of their original purpose that would have delighted Thor himself. Not everyone joined the rebellion, of course. Many worlds remained loyal to Vandire, either because their populations had been too thoroughly indoctrinated to question his authority, or because the local military forces were too powerful for a civilian uprising to overcome. The Frateres Templar, though severely weakened by the loss of their fleet, still maintained garrisons on thousands of worlds, and these garrisons fought with desperate ferocity to maintain Vandire's control. While the result was a galaxy-spanning civil conflict that pitted world against world, sector against sector, and sometimes even family against family. Thor began a great pilgrimage across the galaxy, traveling from system to system, preaching his message of reform and denouncing Vandire as the true heretic. His army of the faithful grew with every world he visited. By the time he reached the borders of the Segmentum Solar, it numbered in the millions, a vast tide of humanity united by shared faith and shared suffering, and the unshakable conviction that they were doing the Emperor's work. No one knew exactly who Thor was, and in the chaos of the rebellion, all manner of wild rumors and speculation surrounded him. Some of the High Lords feared he might be a demon in disguise, a creature of the warp, masquerading as a holy man to sow discord within the Imperium. Others suspected he was a psyker of tremendous power, wielding mind control to bend entire populations to his will. The truth, as is so often the case, was far simpler and far more extraordinary. Thor was just a man born in a Schola Progenium habitat on Dimmermar, raised in the faith, gifted with an eloquence and charisma that defied rational explanation. He claimed to have received visions from the Emperor, warnings that humanity was falling, and whether or not these visions were genuine, the effect they had on those who heard him speak was undeniable. Thor could reach into the hearts and minds of people in a way that transcended language and culture, and the vast distances that separated the worlds of the Imperium. He did not command obedience, but he inspired it. He did not demand loyalty, he earned it. People who had never heard of the Confederation of Light, people who had never questioned the ecclesiarchy's authority before, heard Thor's words and found themselves unable to deny their truth. This was not manipulation. This was something deeper, something that many would later argue could only have come from the Emperor himself. And they were not alone. The Adeptus Astartes and the Adeptus Mechanicus, those two great pillars of imperial power that had remained aloof from the political chaos for so long, began to take notice. Space Marine chapter masters in the Segmentum Solar and the sectors nearest to Terra started voicing their support for the reform movement. The Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a figure named Gastaf Hediatrix, issued a formal demand to the Holy Synod. Gog Vandire was to be immediately indicted and called to account for his crimes. Vandire's response was predictable. He dissolved the Senatorum Imperialis, effectively dismissing the entire governing council of the Imperium. He ordered what forces remained loyal to him to attack the Space Marines and the Adeptus Mechanicus, who had dared question his authority. It was the act of a desperate man, and it sealed his fate. The fall of the tyrant, siege and salvation. The assault on the ecclesiarchal palace on Terra was one of the most significant military engagements in imperial history since the siege of the Emperor's palace during the Horus Heresy. And like that earlier conflict, it would reshape the Imperium in ways that its participants could scarcely have imagined. Yet the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus ordered several regiments of Scutari, the Mechanicus's cybernetically enhanced soldiers, to attack the ecclesiarchal palace. They were joined by space marines from multiple chapters, each one responding independently to the call for action against the tyrant. The Imperial Fists, those stubborn defenders who had held the walls of the Emperor's palace against Horus's traitor legions 10,000 years before, answered the call. The Black Templars, zealous crusaders whose High Marshal Sigenandus declared an imperial crusade against Vandyre upon discovering that Vandyre's forces had destroyed several of their chapter keeps through orbital bombardment. The Soul Drinkers and the Firehawks joined the assault force as well, along with elements of the Martian Tech Guard. Yes, it was a formidable coalition, but the ecclesiarchal palace was a fortress of extraordinary proportions. Its walls had been built to withstand sieges, its defenses maintained by generations of tech priests and fortification engineers. And the brides of the Emperor, now numbering over 10,000 of the most skilled warriors in the Imperium, defended every corridor, every chamber, every staircase with a ferocity born of absolute devotion. They believed they were fighting for the Emperor. They believed that the Space Marines and the Mechanicus were the true traitors, and they fought accordingly. The siege ground on for weeks, then months. The attackers made progress, but it was agonizingly slow, purchased in blood at every step. The brides fought with a discipline and skill that shocked even the Space Marines, who were accustomed to facing the galaxy's most dangerous opponents. These were not poorly trained fanatics or easily broken militiamen. These were elite warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of combat. But while the siege raged around the walls of the ecclesiarchal palace, something else was happening deeper within the complex of sacred buildings that comprised the heart of the Imperium's governance. Something that would change everything. Since the beginning of the Reign of Blood, one faction within the Imperial Palace had remained entirely apart from the bloodshed and devastation. Within the secure walls of the inner sanctum, the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's own Praetorian Guard, had continued their eternal vigil over the Golden Throne. As the Custodes had deliberately cut themselves off from the outside world, sealing their section of the palace against all intrusion to ensure the Emperor's protection. Only scraps of information had passed through their sealed walls during the decades of Vandyre's rule, and it was only when the Space Marines and the Adeptus Mechanicus launched their assault that the full extent of the treachery became known to them. In secret meetings with the commanders of the attacking Space Marine chapters, the Custodes learned about the Reign of Blood and how the brides of the Emperor were defending the very man who had perverted the Emperor's will. The Custodes realized that the military solution alone might not be sufficient. The siege could drag on indefinitely, with the brides fighting to the last woman in defense of the man they believed spoke with the Emperor's voice. What was needed was not more firepower, but a way to break the hold that Vandyre's deception had over the brides' hearts. And so a small contingent of custodians, led by a centurion named Longinus of the Companions, made their way through secret passages and forgotten tunnels into the very heart of Vandyre's domain. They emerged within the ecclesiarchal palace, not far from Vandyre's audience chamber, and were immediately confronted by the brides of the Emperor. Longinus laid down his weapons. He walked unarmed into the midst of these warrior women and called for a truce and a parley. For an hour, he made an impassioned plea for the brides to revoke their oaths to Vandyre, and he argued with all the eloquence at his command that they were fighting for evil, not for the Emperor, that the man they served had deceived them, had used their faith as a weapon against the very people they were sworn to protect. The brides were not swayed. They had believed in Vandyre's divine protection for decades. They had killed in his name, fought and bled and watched their sisters die in defense of his reign. To accept that it had all been a lie would be to negate everything they had sacrificed, everything they had suffered, everything they had believed. They could not do it, not on the strength of words alone. Longinus had one option left. Leaving his men as hostages, a guarantee of his good faith, the centurion offered to guide the bride's leader and her most trusted companions to a place where the truth could not be denied. He offered to take them before the emperor himself. The bride's leader was a woman named Alicia Dominica. She was the most skilled warrior among them, the most devout, and the most loyal to Vandaya. If anyone could be convinced, it was her, because her conviction was so strong that only the most overwhelming evidence could shake it. If the evidence failed to convince her, nothing would. Dominica agreed. Together with 5 of her closest companions, warriors named Catherine, Silvana, Lucia, Mina, and Arabella, she followed Longinus down into the deepest levels of the imperial palace, through corridors that no one outside the custodes had walked in millennia, past defenses so ancient and so powerful that they predated the Imperium itself. They descended through levels of the palace that most people did not even know existed, past vaults containing relics from the Age of Strife, past chambers sealed since the Unification Wars, past automated defense systems that still hummed with power after 10,000 years of operation, dormant sentinels waiting for threats that had been dead since before the Great Crusade. The air grew colder as they descended, and heavier, as if the weight of history itself was pressing down upon them with each step. And then they entered the Sanctum Imperialis, the most sacred place in the entire galaxy, the chamber that housed the Golden Throne. No words can adequately describe what that chamber must have looked like. The Golden Throne is not merely a piece of technology or a seat of power. It is the fulcrum upon which the survival of the entire human species rests. Within it sits the Emperor of mankind, yet his body broken and desiccated by 10,000 years of ceaseless psychic exertion, his mind engaged in an eternal battle to sustain the Astronomicon and hold back the predatory entities of the warp. The sheer psychic presence that radiates from the throne is said to be overwhelming, a sensation so profound that some have been driven mad by exposure to it, while others have experienced visions of surpassing beauty and clarity. What occurred before the Golden Throne remains one of the greatest mysteries in imperial history. Dominica and her companions were sworn to absolute secrecy. No record was ever made of what they saw, what they heard, or what was communicated to them. Whether the Emperor spoke to them directly through some manifestation of his psychic power, and whether the sheer, overwhelming reality of his presence stripped away the layers of deception that had clouded their judgment, or whether something else entirely occurred, no living soul can say with certainty. Some scholars of the Ministorum believe that the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom, showed Dominica the truth of Vandaya's nature, the full scope of his crimes, laid bare by divine revelation. Others suggest that simply standing in the Emperor's presence, feeling the immensity of his sacrifice and the depth of his devotion to humanity, was enough to make the deception obvious. Vandaya had claimed to speak with the Emperor's voice. But here, before the throne, Dominica could feel the Emperor's actual presence, and it was nothing like the petty, vicious, self-serving madness that Vandaya had been dispensing in his name. Or whatever the truth, the effect was transformative, complete, irreversible. What we know is what happened next. When Alicia Dominica and her companions emerged from the depths of the imperial palace, Dominica's hair had turned white, bleached by the intensity of whatever she had experienced in the Sanctum Imperialis. She carried with her a mysterious artifact that would come to be known as the Grail of Ages, a black stone goblet whose significance has never been fully explained. And the expression on her face was one of barely controlled fury. The brides, who then reverted to their original title of Daughters of the Emperor, had been awakened to the evil that Vandaya represented. Whatever they had experienced in the presence of the Emperor had burned away every trace of the tyrant's deception, leaving only the pure, incandescent rage of believers who had been made to serve blasphemy. The daughters marched through the ecclesiastical palace in grim silence, their weapons drawn, their faces set with terrible purpose. They pushed open the doors of Vandaya's audience chamber and found him in the midst of yet another insane tirade, scribbling frenzied orders on balled-up pieces of paper, surrounded by the detritus of his crumbling reign. Dominica paused only to condemn him. The words she spoke to Vandaya before his execution would later be engraved on her sarcophagus, preserved for all eternity as a testament to the moment when justice finally caught up with the most reviled tyrant in imperial history. She told him that he had committed the ultimate heresy, that he had turned his back on the emperor and stepped from his light. That he had profaned the emperor's name and almost destroyed everything he had striven to build. That he had perverted and twisted the path the emperor had laid for mankind to tread. And that, as his own decrees had stated, there could be no mercy for such a criminal. Vandaya's response was characteristic of his madness. He barely seemed to register what was happening. Lost in the fog of his own delusions, surrounded by the scattered papers of orders that would never be carried out, he looked up at the woman who had served him faithfully for decades and said words that have echoed through history ever since. "I don't have time to die. I'm too busy." Alicia Dominica drew her power sword. The blade flashed, and as it struck, the Rosarius that had protected Vandaya on San Lior all those years ago, that had started the entire chain of deception, split in two. The conversion field that had once saved his life flickered and died. The sword cleaved through his neck, and the head of Goga Vandaya, 361st Master of the Administratum and self-appointed Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, rolled across the floor of his audience chamber. The reign of blood was over, but the age of apostasy was not yet done. The plague of unbelief, the last fires of madness, the death of Goj Vandaya ended the reign of blood, but it did not end the chaos. The Imperium was a shattered thing, its institutions damaged, its people traumatized, its governance in shambles. Restoring order would take years, decades, centuries. And in the meantime, the power vacuum left by Vandaya's fall created opportunities for other ambitious predators to fill. Many false prophets appeared throughout the anarchic aftermath of Vandaya's reign. Some were little more than madmen leading bands of armed followers through the wreckage of civilization. Others were spiritual demagogues who commanded entire worlds, using their charisma and the general atmosphere of religious fervor to carve out personal empires from the Imperium's weakened body. The most powerful and most dangerous of these opportunists was a man named Bucharest, the apostate cardinal of Gathalamor. Bucharest was, in many ways, a smaller, meaner version of Vandaya himself. He controlled a modest diocese centered on the cardinal world of Gathalamor, a planet that was not wealthy, not powerful, and not particularly important in the grand scheme of the Imperium's affairs. But Bucharest was consumed by jealousy, yet he looked at the achievements of his peers, at their grand cathedrals and their wealthy parishes, and he burned with resentment. He would build something greater. He would create a monument to the emperor's glory that would eclipse anything his rivals had achieved. To accomplish this, Bucharest enslaved the population of Gathalamor. Every man, woman, and child was pressed into service, their labor directed toward the construction of an enormous temple that would be Bucharest's masterpiece. Workers who faltered were beaten. Workers who protested were killed. The people of Gathalamor became slaves, in all but name, their lives reduced to a single purpose, the glorification of their cardinal's ambition. But even the forced labor of an entire planet was not enough. Bucharest needed more resources, more workers, more raw material. And in a bold and violent move, he used a group of hired thugs and cutthroats to conquer the nearby world of Randa, a planet rich in mines and mineral resources. The wealth of Randa flowed into Bucharest's coffers, funding both his construction projects and his personal enrichment. Two other figures joined Bucharest's nascent empire, Admiral Sehala of the Imperial Navy and Colonel Gasto of the Rigelian 25th Regiment of the Astra Militarum. Both threw in their lot with the apostate cardinal. With a naval fleet and a professional military force at his command, Bucharest was no longer just a corrupt cardinal with delusions of grandeur. He was a genuine military threat. Over the next 7 years, Bucharest conquered 50 planets, using their resources and populations to fuel his ever-expanding war machine. and his empire was hidden from the broader Imperium by the dense warp storms that still raged across the region, cutting off communication and travel. News of Sebastian Thor's ascension to the position of ecclesiarch and the reorganization of the ecclesiarchy had not yet penetrated Bucharest's territory. The apostate cardinal blocked all interstellar travel and suppressed any information from the outside, controlling every aspect of what his subjects knew about the wider galaxy. Bucharest declared that the ecclesiarchy on Terra had fallen, corrupted by traitors and heretics. He proclaimed himself the true voice of the emperor and the rightful head of the Adeptus Ministorum. Gathalamor, he announced, was the new center of the imperial faith. His elegant speeches were delivered with thunderous conviction, and to those who had no other source of information, they were persuasive. The plague of unbelief spread as Bucharest's twisted version of the imperial faith took root across his growing domain. The cardinal's ambition grew with each new conquest. Additional Astra Militarum regiments joined his cause, believing his claims about Terra's fall. The ships of Battlefleet Pacificus at the naval base of Hydrafer bowed to the apostate cardinal's authority. Bucharest was becoming powerful enough to threaten the Imperium itself. His elegant speeches were delivered with thunderous conviction, and the populations under his control, deprived of any outside information, had no reason to doubt them. Bucharest declared that every person must strive to help themselves, and that those who could not do so were less than human and a burden upon mankind. And it was a philosophy stripped of compassion, designed to justify the exploitation of the weak by the strong. And it found fertile ground among the ambitious and the ruthless who saw in Bucharest's empire an opportunity for personal advancement. The cardinal's realm expanded in every direction. To the south, he stopped just short of the naval base at Bacca, aware that engaging the squadrons stationed there would draw unwelcome attention. To the north, he gave Cadia and the Eye of Terror a wide berth, terrified that his conquests would attract the notice of the Chaos Space Marines who lurked in that accursed region. But everywhere else, his armies marched, his preachers preached, and his tyranny spread like a disease. After a series of particularly eloquent speeches, Bucharest's planets were transformed into little kingdoms where mobs ruled and fought among themselves. Petty nobles used their wealth to establish personal fiefdoms within the cardinal's broader domain. Neighbors fought neighbors, and families split over the spoils of the arising chaos. Those who caught Bucharest's eye with their strength and their willingness to commit violence were rewarded with power and lavish gifts. Those who failed were punished with a cruelty that rivaled Vandia's own. But Bucharest made a critical error. In his northward expansion, he pushed into the territories surrounding the homeworld of the Space Wolves chapter, the frozen death world of Fenris. The Space Wolves had kept themselves aloof from the political chaos of the Age of Apostasy, preferring to defend their own domains rather than involve themselves in the machinations of distant terror. But when Bucharest's forces began conquering the systems around Fenris, the Wolves had all the provocation they needed. Bucharest invaded Fenris itself, landing vast armies on the planet's frozen surface. His troops enslaved the native Fenrisians, putting them to work building roads and supplying his soldiers. Communities were slaughtered, settlements razed, livestock butchered for the officers' feasting tables. The women were enslaved, and the young and old were killed and left for the carrion birds that circled Fenris's inhospitable skies. Bucharest pushed his advance toward the Fang, the Space Wolves' fortress monastery, a massive polar citadel carved into the heart of a mountain. He surrounded it with his armies, bombarding it with gigantic cannons and orbital fire. The mountains shook with the force of the bombardment, creating avalanches and tremendous destruction across the surrounding landscape. But the Fang held. Its defenses, built and maintained over millennia by the most accomplished fortress builders in the Imperium, withstood everything Bucharest could throw at them. The Space Wolves inside were not besieged. They were biding their time. Wolf scouts slipped out of the fortress through hidden passages and disrupted the enemy supply lines, destroying ammunition stores and sabotaging siege equipment. The Space Wolves fleet, operating from dispersed positions throughout the system, conducted hit-and-run attacks on Bucharest's transport ships, cutting the flow of reinforcements and supplies. Then the hammer fell. As a fleet of Space Wolves battle barges, led by the great wolf Keel Grimblood, returned to the Fenris system from outside the sector. They struck Bucharest's orbital fleet with devastating force, smashing nearly half of his ships in the first engagement. Caught between Grimblood's arriving force and the Space Wolves' vessels already operating in-system, Admiral Sahala ordered a panicked withdrawal. Grimblood did not pursue the fleeing ships. He drove directly for Fenris. The counterattack by his great company killed tens of thousands of traitor soldiers in the first week alone. The invaders were hurled from the mountain passes, and those who survived to reach the frozen flats below still perished, picked off by giant wolf packs and the lethal Fenrisian climate. Every single invader on the planet was killed or driven off. Bucharest escaped on a shuttle, linking up with what remained of Sahala's fleet. But the damage was done. The assault on Fenris had cost him the bulk of his best troops, and his empire, though still nominally intact, had been fatally weakened. And then came Confessor Dolan Carosius. Dolan was a wandering preacher and holy man who had been traveling through Bucharest's domain, quietly spreading the true word of the imperial faith and undermining the apostate cardinal's propaganda. He moved from world to world, always one step ahead of Bucharest's enforcers, planting seeds of doubt in populations that had been fed nothing but lies for years. He was, in many ways, a smaller echo of Sebastian Thor, a simple man of faith who refused to accept that tyranny had the final word. The pattern of his work was distinctive and effective. A suspicious craft would land on a planet within Bucharest's domain. Days or weeks later, an uprising would occur. The rulers Bucharest had installed would be expelled. The planet would declare its independence. It was happening too frequently and too systematically to be coincidence, and eventually Bucharest's agents traced the disturbances back to their source. Dolan was captured and brought before the cardinal himself. What happened next was a masterclass in the arrogance of tyrants. Bucharest, confident in his own power and eager to make a public example, decided to put Dolan on trial rather than simply executing him. It would be a spectacle, a demonstration of the cardinal's absolute authority, broadcast across every planet in his realm so that all might see the fate that awaited those who dared to challenge his rule. The trial was broadcast across every planet in Bucharest's realm, and Bucharest made the catastrophic mistake of allowing Dolan to speak in his own defense. The confessor, given a platform that reached billions, did not plead for his life. He preached. He spoke of the emperor's true will, of the corruption and lies upon which Bucharest's empire was built, of the hope represented by Sebastian Thor and the reformed ecclesiarchy. His words reached into the hearts of people who had been living under Bucharest's tyranny, people who had suspected the truth but lacked the courage to act. Every word Dolan spoke was a weapon more devastating than any cannon or lass bolt. He did not rail or rage. He simply told the truth, calmly and with complete conviction. And the truth was so far from the lies Bucharest had been telling that the contrast was impossible to miss. People who had accepted the cardinal's rule out of fear and ignorance suddenly found themselves unable to maintain the pretense. The emperor's true servants were alive. The ecclesiarchy had been reformed. Terror had not fallen. They had been deceived. Bucharest, realizing too late the magnitude of his error, was consumed with fury. He stripped Dolan of his clerical vestments, had him publicly flogged across the entire planet, and then executed him. The confessor's body was flung over the walls of the cardinal palace in a final act of contemptuous dismissal. But the body disappeared shortly afterward, vanishing in circumstances that many took as yet another sign of divine intervention. A pattern that by now should have been terrifyingly familiar to anyone who had been paying attention to the events of the age of apostasy. The populations of every world under Bucharest's control erupted into simultaneous rebellion. The uprisings spread with an eerie coordination, as if some unseen force were orchestrating them. System after system defied the apostate cardinal. The rulers he had installed were overthrown. His armies, already depleted from the catastrophe on Fenris, were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the revolt. Bucharest tried to flee. He made it as far as a starport on Gathalamor before a mob caught him. The crowd tore him apart. When they dispersed, nothing remained of the apostate cardinal but a pile of scattered ashes and the bitter memory of his reign. With Bucharest's death, the Inquisition moved swiftly to purge the remnants of his empire. Tens of thousands who had served him were brought to trial and punished. The High Lords of Terror re-established control over the affected regions. The ecclesiarchy dispatched thousands of missionaries to restore the true teachings of the imperial faith. The plague of unbelief, the final symptom of the age of apostasy, had come to an end. Shadows within shadows, the wars of vindication. But the age of apostasy had one more dark chapter to write before its conclusion. Because Van Dyer's corruption had reached deeper into the Imperium's institutions than anyone had realized. And nowhere was this more evident than in the Officio Assassinorum, the Imperium's deadliest and most secretive organization. The Officio Assassinorum was the Emperor's scalpel, a clandestine agency that trained the most lethal killers in the galaxy. Its agents, drawn from the various assassin temples, each specialized in a different form of sanctioned murder. Vindicare snipers who could eliminate a target from kilometers away with a single perfectly placed shot. Calidus infiltrators who used the shape-shifting drug polymorphine to assume the identity of their target's most trusted allies. Culexus anti-psychers, whose very presence was anathema to those touched by the warp. Eversaw berserkers, chemically enhanced killing machines unleashed upon enemies who required nothing less than total annihilation. During Van Dyer's reign of blood, the Officio Assassinorum had been corrupted from within. Van Dyer had used bribery and blackmail to turn many of the Officio's highest-ranking members into his personal instruments of terror, deploying assassins against anyone who opposed his rule, regardless of whether they posed a legitimate threat to the Imperium. The most dangerous of Van Dyer's agents within the Officio was a Calidus assassin named Tsiz Jarek. Using her mastery of polymorphine, Jarek had assassinated the Grand Master of Assassins, the head of the entire Officio Assassinorum, and assumed his identity. From this position, she had directed the Officio's resources to serve Van Dyer's personal agenda, perverting the purpose of the Imperium's most powerful covert organization. But the ever-cautious Grand Master had anticipated the possibility of exactly such an attack. Before Jarek made her move, the Grand Master had arranged for an identical body double to take his place in his most vulnerable moments. The man Jarek killed was a decoy. The real Grand Master survived, escaping into hiding with those agents who remained loyal to him and to the Emperor. After Van Dyer's death, the Grand Master emerged from hiding and launched a devastating counterattack against the traitors who had corrupted his organization. The conflict that followed became known as the Wars of Vindication, and it was one of the most terrifying engagements in Imperial history, not because of its scale, but because of who was fighting. The Wars of Vindication were fought not between armies or fleets, but between assassins. The most skilled killers in the galaxy hunted each other through the corridors of the Imperial Palace itself, yet using weapons and techniques so deadly that most had been banned by the Senatorum Imperialis centuries ago. Ancient arsenals of forbidden and alien weaponry were opened and deployed. Traps of extraordinary lethality were laid in the most sacred precincts of the Imperium's governance. It was a shadow war fought in darkness, where the participants were ghosts who could kill with a thought, a touch, or a look from 1,000 meters away. Imagine what this must have been like for the ordinary servants and administrators who worked in the Imperial Palace. One day, everything seems normal, or as normal as anything can be in the aftermath of a galaxy-spanning civil war. The next day, a senior official is found dead in his office, his body showing no visible wounds, but his brain liquefied by a Calexus assassin's psychic null field. A week later, a woman who has served in the palace archives for 20 years suddenly peels off her own face, revealing features that do not match any known individual, and attempts to poison the water supply of an entire wing. A Vindicar sniper's round shatters a stained glass window and kills a man standing in a hallway that was supposed to be off-limits to everyone. The fighting eventually spilled into the open, causing horrific collateral damage to the palace complex and terrifying those Imperial servants unlucky enough to be caught in the crossfire. For weeks, the most dangerous individuals in the Imperium waged an internecine war that could have destabilized the entire Officio Assassinorum if left unchecked. Weapons that had not been deployed since the darkest days of the Horus Heresy were brought to bear. Some of these weapons were of alien origin, confiscated from conquered species and locked away in the Officio's deepest vaults, precisely because they were too dangerous to use under normal circumstances. These were not normal circumstances. In the end, the true Grand Master tracked down Tsiz Jarek and killed her, ending the conflict. But the victory was Pyrrhic. The Officio's hierarchy had been shattered, its ranks decimated, its reputation damaged. The Grand Master himself disappeared into self-imposed exile, his fate unknown to this day. In the aftermath of the Wars of Vindication, Inquisitor Jaeger conducted a thorough investigation into the Officio Assassinorum's activities during the Age of Apostasy. His findings were damning. The Officio had been far too vulnerable to corruption, as its secretive nature making it all but impossible for external authorities to detect wrongdoing until it was too late. Jaeger proposed the creation of a new branch of the Inquisition, dedicated specifically to monitoring and controlling the Officio Assassinorum. His proposal was accepted, and the Ordo Sicarius was born, charged with ensuring that the Imperium's assassins would never again be turned against the people they were supposed to protect. The assassin temples themselves were dispersed to separate locations throughout the galaxy, breaking up the concentration of power that had made them vulnerable to Vandire's manipulation. New rules were put in place to ensure that no single individual could ever again control all the temples simultaneously. The Officio Assassinorum would continue to serve as the Emperor's blade. But now there would be eyes watching the hand that held it. The Reformation, Sebastian Thor, and the birth of a new order. With Vandire dead, the plague of unbelief crushed, and the Wars of Vindication concluded, the Imperium stood at a crossroads. The institutions that had governed humanity for millennia were damaged, discredited, and desperately in need of reform. The question was not whether change was necessary, it was who would carry it out, and how far they would go. The answer, of course, was Sebastian Thor. After the fall of Vandire, Thor worked closely with the Fabricator General of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and with the chapter masters of the Space Marine chapters that had participated in the liberation of Terra. Together, they began the painstaking work of restoring the rule of law to the Imperium. So Vandire's collaborators were identified, tried, and those found guilty were executed. The High Lords of Terra were reconstituted from among those officials who had joined the opposition against Vandire. The Senatorum Imperialis was restored to its former function as the governing council of the Imperium. The position of ecclesiarch, however, remained empty, and everyone knew who should fill it. Thor refused. The greatest hero of the Age of Apostasy, the man whose charisma and faith had rallied the galaxy against tyranny, the preacher whose name had become synonymous with the Emperor's own will, simply said no. He was too busy, he explained. There was still work to be done out among the stars, still people who needed to hear the Emperor's true word. He had no desire to sit on a throne in terror and play politics. As the High Lords were stunned, then they were furious. They offered again. Thor refused again. They offered a third time, with increasing insistence. Thor declined politely but firmly, citing his desire to continue his preaching work on the northern rim of the galaxy. The insulted High Lords, apparently having learned nothing from the Age of Apostasy about the dangers of authoritarian overreach, declared Sebastian Thor a traitor to the Imperium and dispatched forces to apprehend him. Thor, demonstrating the humility that defined his character, willingly turned himself in when confronted by the Adeptus Arbites. A great trial on Terra began, personally overseen by the High Lords themselves. It lasted for months, with witnesses and evidence presented from across the Imperium. Thor stood accused of treason, but his defense was simple. He had done what the Emperor required of him, nothing more, nothing less. The verdict was delivered by the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, the commander of the Emperor's own bodyguard. Thor was declared innocent of every charge brought against him. Mass celebration erupted across Terra at the news. Once again, the High Lords offered Thor the position of ecclesiarch. Once again, he refused, insisting that he would rather spend his remaining years spreading the Emperor's word among the common people. The High Lords were apoplectic. But before the situation could escalate further, the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, that silent guardian who had watched over the Emperor for 10,000 years, took Thor aside and whispered a single message into his ear. No one else heard what was said. The most common theory is that the Captain General threatened Thor with death if he refused the position again. Others speculate that a message from the Emperor himself was conveyed, delivered through whatever means the Custodes use to communicate with their sovereign. Whatever the truth, when Thor emerged from this private conference, he announced to the adoring masses that he would accept the position of ecclesiarch. But he had conditions. He would travel freely across the galaxy, continuing his preaching work among the people. He would have the unswerving backing of the High Lords in all his endeavors, and he would be permitted to make whatever changes to the Holy Synod, the governing body of the ecclesiarchy, that he deemed necessary. The High Lords agreed, and Sebastian Thor became the 292nd ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum. For the best part of the next century, Thor worked tirelessly to reform the Imperium. His changes were sweeping, profound, and designed to ensure that the horrors of the age of apostasy could never be repeated. The most famous and most consequential of Thor's reforms was the Decree Passive, promulgated in 288 of the 36th Millennium by the High Lords of Terra at Thor's direction. The decree's language was blunt and unambiguous. The ecclesiarchy was forbidden, under threat of execution, from gathering, training, promoting, sustaining, or in any way commanding any force of men under arms. This was a direct and devastating blow to the ecclesiarchy's military power. The Frateris Templar, that fanatical army that had served as the Ministorum's iron fist for centuries, was disbanded. Its soldiers were disarmed, its fleets decommissioned, and its fortresses handed over to other imperial institutions. The ecclesiarchy would never again command its own army. It would never again be able to use military force to impose its will on the Imperium's people. But Thor was not naive. He understood that the ecclesiarchy still needed some form of protection. Without any armed force at all, the Ministorum would be vulnerable to precisely the kind of bullying and manipulation by the administratum that had helped create the conditions for Vandire's rise in the first place. The ecclesiarchy needed defenders, just not an army of men. And this is where Thor displayed the political genius that lurked beneath his humble exterior. Because the Decree Passive specifically forbade the ecclesiarchy from commanding any force of men under arms, and the daughters of the Emperor, those warrior women who had been deceived by Vandire and later redeemed before the Golden Throne, were not men. Thor reorganized the daughters of the Emperor into a new organization, the Adepta Sororitas, the Sisters of Battle. Their orders: militant would serve as the ecclesiarchy's standing armed force, defending the faith and prosecuting wars of faith when necessary. But the sisters were not simply the ecclesiarchy's soldiers. They were also its watchdogs. Their ultimate loyalty was to the Emperor alone, and they were charged with monitoring the ecclesiarchy's leadership for any sign of the corruption and power hunger that had characterized the age of apostasy. If any future ecclesiarch or cardinal attempted to repeat Vandire's crimes, the Sisters of Battle would be the first to stand against them. It was a brilliant arrangement. The ecclesiarchy got its armed protectors. The Imperium got an internal check on the Ministorum's power, and the women who had been most cruelly deceived by Vandire's regime were given a purpose that transformed their tragedy into a legacy of vigilance and righteousness that endures to this very day. Thor also established the Holy Synod of Terra, a council of cardinals designed to distribute the ecclesiarchy's governing authority and prevent its concentration in any single individual. A sister synod was created on Ophelia VII, providing a secondary center of ecclesiarchal governance that could serve as a check on Terra's authority. The ecclesiarchy was explicitly barred from holding any other office within the Imperium, preventing a future ecclesiarch from accumulating the kind of dual authority that had made Vandir so dangerous. This last reform was perhaps the most important of all, because it addressed the fundamental structural weakness that had made the Reign of Blood possible. Vandir's power had not come from his control of the ecclesiarchy alone, or from his control of the administratum alone. It had come from his control of both simultaneously. By holding the highest positions in the Imperium's two most powerful civilian institutions at the same time, he had created a feedback loop of authority in which each position reinforced the other. As ecclesiarch, he could claim divine sanction for his political decisions. As master of the administratum, he could use the machinery of government to enforce his religious edicts. The combination was far more dangerous than either position would have been on its own. The Thor's reforms ensured that this could never happen again. The separation of church and state, such as it exists in the Imperium, dates to this period. The ecclesiarchy retained its enormous cultural and spiritual influence, but its ability to directly wield political power was severely curtailed. Cardinals could advise and influence, but they could not command. The ecclesiarch sat among the high lords of Terra, but he was one voice among many rather than the dominant authority. It was not a perfect solution. No solution is when you are governing 1,000,000 worlds across a galaxy haunted by hostile aliens and malevolent gods. The ecclesiarchy's influence would continue to ebb and flow in the millennia that followed, and there would be moments when ambitious cardinals and confessors would push the boundaries of the decree passive and the other Thorian reforms. But the fundamental architecture of governance that Thor established has proven remarkably durable, surviving crises that would have shattered lesser institutions. But Thor was not the only reformer at work. The Inquisition, that secretive organization charged with defending the Imperium from all threats both external and internal, recognized that the age of apostasy had exposed critical weaknesses in the Imperium's ability to police its own leadership. In response, two new branches of the Inquisition were created. The Ordo Hereticus was tasked with monitoring the ecclesiarchy and the broader Imperium for signs of heresy, corruption, and the abuse of power. And its jurisdiction was vast. It could investigate anyone, from the lowliest parish priest to the most powerful cardinal, and it had the authority to judge and condemn even the highest officials of the Imperium if they were found to have betrayed the Emperor's trust. The Sisters of Battle were named the Chamber Militant of the Ordo Hereticus, creating a formal link between the ecclesiarchy's armed force and the Inquisition's watchdog organization. The Ordo Sicarius, as we discussed, was created to monitor the Officio Assassinorum in the wake of the Wars of Vindication, ensuring that the Imperium's assassins could never again be turned into instruments of political tyranny. Together, these reforms represented the most comprehensive restructuring of imperial governance since the aftermath of the Horus heresy itself. Thor had not merely patched the cracks that the Age of Apostasy had exposed. He had fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the Imperium, creating new institutions, new checks, new balances, designed to prevent a single individual or organization from ever again accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Vandir had wielded. Thor continued his reforms for nearly a century, traveling across the galaxy to personally oversee the implementation of his changes while continuing to preach the message of humility, service, and genuine faith that had inspired the Confederation of Light. He visited Terra only once after the liberation, and that visit was his last. Sebastian Thor died at the age of 112, his body exhausted beyond the ability of rejuvenate technology to sustain. He was canonized as a saint almost immediately, recognized as one of the most important figures in the history of the imperial faith. His preserved head, in a final irony that perhaps only the 40th millennium could produce, is currently in the possession of Trazyn the Infinite, the eccentric Necron overlord of Solemnice, who collects artifacts and relics from across the galaxy with the enthusiasm of a cosmic museum curator. One imagines that Thor, who spent his life preaching humility, would have found the whole situation faintly absurd. The Long Shadow, legacy of an age that almost ended. Everything. The Age of Apostasy reshaped the Imperium of man in ways that are still felt 10,000 years later. It was not just a political crisis or a military conflict. It was a wound cut into the soul of human civilization, as a reminder that the Imperium's greatest enemy has never been the aliens pressing in from beyond the borders or the demons clawing their way out of the warp. The greatest enemy has always been humanity itself. The institutional reforms that followed the Age of Apostasy, the Decree Passive, the creation of the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Sicarius, the restructuring of the ecclesiarchy's governing bodies, the establishment of the Adepta Sororitas, became pillars of imperial governance that endure into the 42nd millennium and beyond. They are imperfect pillars, as all human creations are. The Decree Passive has been bent and stretched over the centuries, with bands of frateris militia, technically volunteers rather than professional soldiers, gathering in times of need to fight wars of faith. The ecclesiarchy's influence continues to wax and wane, and the temple tendency, a secret movement within the Ministorum that seeks to return to the pre-Reformation ways of the Temple of the Saviour Emperor, persists in the shadows despite the best efforts of the Ordo Hereticus. But the fundamental principle that Thor fought for, the idea that no single person or institution should hold unchecked power over the bodies and souls of the Emperor's subjects, has remained remarkably durable. It has survived warp storms and alien invasions, political upheavals and demonic incursions, the opening of the Great Rift and the return of Robut Guilliman. It endures because the memory of what happened when that principle was abandoned is too terrible to forget. But the statues of Goj Vandaya were torn down by the masses during the Reformation that followed his death. Many were so enormous that they could not be completely destroyed, and their remains were dragged to remote locations and left to erode, monuments to madness slowly being reclaimed by nature. Some were incorporated into the fabric of the cathedrals they had been built beside, too deeply embedded to remove without destroying the entire structure. These eerie graveyards of fallen idols still exist, forbidden places, heavy with the weight of ages, where the ghosts of the Reign of Blood whisper warnings to any who dare approach. The Adepta Sororitas, born from the deception and redemption of the daughters of the Emperor, went on to become one of the most formidable military forces in the Imperium. In their orders, militant have fought in countless campaigns across the galaxy, their faith a weapon as potent as their bolters and flamers. Alicia Dominica, who struck the blow that ended Vandaya's reign, eventually fell in battle on Friedaswide's world, surviving hundreds of wounds before a single traitor's lasergun bolt found her heart. She was declared a saint, and the 6 women who stood before the Emperor in the depths of the Sanctum Imperialis, Dominica, Catherine, Silvana, Lucia, Mina, and Arabella, became the patron saints of the major orders militant that carry their legacy forward into an uncertain future. The Thorian faction of the Inquisition, named for Sebastian Thor himself, pursues the belief that Thor was not merely inspired by the Emperor, but was in some sense a vessel for the Emperor's own consciousness. The Thorians seek a way to enable the Emperor's rebirth, believing that his spirit can inhabit mortal hosts and walk among humanity once more. Whether this is visionary theology or dangerous delusion remains a subject of intense and occasionally violent debate within the Inquisition. The Thorians point to figures throughout history who seem to possess a measure of the Emperor's own charisma and power, individuals like Saint Capelline and the hero Josmain, as evidence that the Emperor's spirit has walked among his people before and can do so again. They believe that the Emperor's near death at the hands of Horus allowed him to transcend the limitations of physical form, to become something closer to the God that his people have always believed him to be, a being whose consciousness can wander the warp, moving from place to place and perhaps even through time itself, touching mortal minds and guiding human destiny from beyond the veil of flesh. Opponents of the Thorians counter that any attempt to reincarnate the Emperor would be catastrophic. It would cause a schism within the Imperium that would make the age of apostasy look like a minor disagreement. Believers and unbelievers would wage a holy war of annihilation. And even if the reincarnation succeeded, there is no guarantee that what came back would be the Emperor as he once was. 10,000 years of sustained psychic exertion, of battling demonic entities within the warp, while simultaneously maintaining the Astronomicon, might have changed him in ways that no one can predict. And then there is the practical question. What happens to the Astronomicon if the Emperor leaves the Golden Throne? The beacon that guides humanity's ships through the warp, the light that keeps the Imperium connected across the impossible distances of space, all of it depends on the Emperor's continued presence on the throne. Remove him, even briefly, and the Imperium could collapse into isolation and darkness within months. These debates may seem academic, abstract arguments between theologians and inquisitors in dusty libraries far from the front lines of the Imperium's endless wars. But they are not abstract at all. They are a direct consequence of the age of apostasy, of the questions that era raised about the nature of faith, the limits of institutional power, and the relationship between the Emperor and his people. The age of apostasy did not just reshape the Imperium's institutions, it reshaped the way humanity thinks about its own relationship with the divine. There is another legacy of the age of apostasy that deserves mention, one that is less often discussed, but no less significant. The era produced a deep and enduring suspicion of concentrated power within imperial governance. Before Vandir, the various organs of imperial government had competed for influence through political maneuvering and institutional rivalry, but there had been no fundamental questioning of whether power itself was dangerous. After Vandir, that question became impossible to avoid. The reforms Thor implemented were not just practical measures designed to prevent a repeat of the Reign of Blood, but they were expressions of a philosophical shift in how the Imperium understood governance. The decree passive was not merely a military regulation. It was a statement that no single institution should ever again command both spiritual authority and armed force. The creation of the Ordo Hereticus was not just the establishment of a new investigative body. It was an acknowledgement that the Imperium's own leaders were as dangerous as any alien invader, and that watching for threats from within was as important as defending against threats from without. This suspicion of concentrated power has had profound effects on imperial governance in the millennia since the age of apostasy. It is one of the reasons why the Senatorum Imperialis has remained a council rather than evolving into a more streamlined executive authority. And it is one of the reasons why the Inquisition operates with such extraordinary independence, answering to no one but the Emperor himself. And it is one of the reasons why, when Robert Guilliman returned to the Imperium in the 42nd Millennium and assumed the title of Lord Commander of the Imperium, his authority was regarded with as much suspicion as relief by many within the imperial establishment. The memory of what happened the last time one person held supreme power is too deeply burned into the Imperium's collective consciousness to be easily set aside. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Age of Apostasy is not institutional or military. It is spiritual. The Age of Apostasy demonstrated, with devastating clarity, the danger of allowing faith to become a tool of power. And the ecclesiarchy had started as a genuine expression of humanity's need for spiritual meaning in a terrifying universe. It became a weapon, wielded by the ambitious and the corrupt against the very people it was supposed to serve. And when faith was perverted into tyranny, the result was suffering on a scale that rivaled the Horus heresy itself. Sebastian Thor's greatest achievement was not the decree passive or the creation of the Adepta Sororitas. It was the restoration of the imperial faith's moral center. He reminded humanity that the emperor's sacrifice was not a justification for building bigger temples or demanding heavier tithes. It was an example of what it means to give everything for the good of others, an example of humility and service, and the willingness to suffer so that others might live. That message, as simple and powerful and eternally relevant, is what makes the Age of Apostasy more than just another bloody chapter in the Imperium's bloody history. It is a reminder that even in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, the human spirit is capable of choosing something better, of looking at the darkness and saying, "No, not this, not in my name." The war continues. It always continues. Humanity faces threats that would crush lesser species and horrors that defy comprehension. The enemies pressing in from every direction grow stronger with each passing century, and the Imperium's ability to hold them back grows ever more tenuous. The Golden Throne is failing. The Great Rift has split the galaxy in half, and in every corner of the Imperium, people struggle and suffer and fight and die. Their lives spent in service to a cause they may never fully understand. But in the cathedrals and the shrines, in the words of the confessors and the prayers of the faithful, the echo of Sebastian Thor's message can still be heard. A voice from across the millennia, reminding humanity of what it is capable of when faith is genuine and sacrifice is real. A voice that says, "The Emperor did not sit upon the golden throne so that you could build statues in his name. He sat upon the golden throne so that you might live. So live. Live well. Live in service to each other, and never, ever allow the light to be taken from you again." That is the story of the Age of Apostasy, a story of corruption and redemption, of tyranny and liberation, of the worst that humanity can do and the best that it can become. It is one of the defining chapters in the long history of the Imperium of Man, and its lessons remain as vital today as they were when Sebastian Thor first raised his voice on the forgotten world of Dimmermar and dared to speak the truth. And speaking of vital things, if you enjoyed this deep dive into the darkness of the 36th millennium, consider hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Every subscription helps bring more stories like this one to life. There is so much more of the Imperium's history to explore together. So many more tales of heroes and villains, and the ordinary people caught between them. Until next time, stay faithful, stay curious, and remember that in the grim darkness of the far future, there is always a light burning somewhere. You just have to know where to look.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.